Hey guys and gals, happy day after Thanksgiving. Um, Wanted to do a quick little video on everything fishing line. Um, I've had a lot of questions after my rod video on what kind of line I use, the differences between the line, and why. So we're going to kind of run through just a brief overview. And again, everybody, please keep in mind these are my personal preferences. This is, and I will explain why I use what I use for each application. But again, we all have our preferences and things that we find work better for certain situations. So let's just quickly cover the three main types of line: your monofilament, your fluorocarbon. So let's start with monofilament. This is probably the line that I use the least, at least for bass fishing. When I grew up fishing walleye, that was essentially all that I would use. But in the world of bass fishing, there's only a handful of times that I've ever really used it. And let's talk about that. One, monofilament floats. That's a pro. Can be a pro, can be a con. It's got the most stretch out of any other lines out there, which also can be a pro or a con. Another thing, a thing that I don't particularly like is the amount of memory that it has. When it comes off the reel, it retains that coiled kind of shape, and that can be kind of hard to manage at times. Times that I've used monofilament, I can remember a few situations here recently. Say I'm fishing a wacky rig or a weightless plastic, and my fish are suspended, or I just want that bait to hang out in that water column just a little bit longer. I will throw a monofilament leader on with my spinning setup. That way that bait kind of floats and hangs out in that sweet spot as long as possible, especially if it's a real fickle bite. I have been known to do that a few times. Another example, sometimes I will throw straight mono on one of my bait casters for topwater. Topwater, I'll almost always exclusively fish monofilament or braid. For the most part, most of my topwater stuff, especially my faster moving baits, I throw on braided line. But if I'm fishing like table rock and I'm fishing a walking baits, and those fish have time to come up and kind of look at it, and I want that a little bit more of a stealth finesse type situation, I will either run straight mono or I will tie on a monofilament leader when I'm running mainline braid for topwater. And about the only other time I would find myself using mono would be Carolina rig. I do use mono for a Carolina rig leader, and that is simply because when I'm fishing a Carolina rig, and again, I'll almost always run mainline braid and tie a leader. Sometimes I've had situations where I have a whole reel spooled up with monofilament for a Carolina rig too, but I like, with those things, I like having a main line of braid. Again, the reason I do this is when you're fishing a Carolina rig, you essentially want that bait to float. I will have a monofilament leader on for all my Carolina rig stuff, so that whatever bait I'm running, for the most part, is going to have a little bit more buoyancy in the water. Now, I do know a lot of anglers that prefer fishing monofilament on their crankbait rods. I throw my cranks on a glass rod, so I don't necessarily feel like I need any of that extra stretch that monofilament provides. It's a little more forgiving if you're not throwing it on a glass rod. But for me, I do not throw monofilament for my crankbaits because I throw them on a glass rod. So I feel like I've got the perfect setup there with what I throw for what I use monofilament for. Again, though, to each their own. We all have our certain reasons, and it could vary greatly depending on what blank you're using as well. So let's get into the line that I use the most. We're going to talk about fluorocarbon. I throw fluorocarbon on about 80% of my setups. A lot of my stuff I'm running straight fluorocarbon, and it's tough to beat Sunline FC Sniper. This is hands down my best leader line and main line when I'm fishing a jig, a Texas rig, moving baits even. This is what I throw. Depending on I know a lot of people wonder what pound test I use, and that really varies depending on what I'm doing and where I'm at. Well, I'll be up on St. Clair, probably throwing 6, 8, 10, or 12 pound test. I'm probably not going to do that down fish in the brush on Lake Fork, Texas for giant Florida strain bass. It really depends on where I'm at. That's why on all of my spinning rods, I'll run a main line of typically 20-pound braid, and then that way I can switch out my leader line depending on where I'm at. And as for my bait casters, as a general rule of thumb, a lot of your crankbaits are rated for 12-pound fluorocarbon, so that's generally where I start for the majority of my crankbaits, these square bills, DT6, DT10. When it comes to crankbait fishing, the one thing to remember, the heavier the test, the less that crankbait is going to dive. So the larger diameter of line is going to prevent you from getting down to that depth at which that crankbait is rated, if that makes sense. So unfortunately for your 6, 8, 10 XDs, that's when I'll bump up to like a 16, 18, if I absolutely have to, 20-pound fluorocarbon, because it's such a beefier crank, and a lot of times I'm really getting that down into deeper brush piles. But that does kind of affect the depth that crankbait will dive. So for the most part, and again, I don't do a whole lot of that real deep cranking. Very, very few times do I find myself doing that. So primarily I'm running 12-pound fluorocarbon on a lot of my crankbait setups. I throw a 12-pound fluoro for my spinner baits, my jerkbait rod, anything with a moderate fast. I love throwing fluoro on. Jigs, Texas rig. I just am an angler that prefers fluorocarbon. I like the feel of it. I like the elusiveness of it. I'm comfortable with it. So most of my stuff, I'm trying to think through all my rods and reels here. Again, I'm a little scatterbrained right now after the holiday. Again, with my spinning setups, depending on where I'm at, if I'm drop shotting, I'm fishing super clear water, I usually stick to 8 to 10 pound. Will go as low as 6, will go as heavy as 14 if I need to. But I like being able to have the ability wherever I'm going. If I'm fishing if I'm fishing stained water, I'm fishing water where I'm fishing around a lot of brush and a lot of rock, I will bump it up to 20 and even 25-pound test for my jig rod, a heavy Texas rig, any of that type of stuff. My utility rod, I will beef up that line just a little bit. So that brings us to our last line category, which would be braid. Now, as you all know, the nice thing about braid, there's absolutely zero stretch. The most common ways to fish braid, your frog rod, a lot of your flipping and pitching rods. People will, especially in that real tannic water down south, straight braid is a huge plus. I know that a lot of people prefer using the chartreuse and the bright lines for when you're flipping, when you're punching, to watch for that little tick in the line. Helps it be a little more visible, so you can detect those bites. So here's kind of how I do things. With my frog rod, I run a 65-pound braid, either Suffix 832 or Power Pro. I've had good luck with both of those two types of braid in the past. So the reason I've used 50 and I've snapped it frog fishing. So I've been told by a lot of great anglers before me 65 is a minimum. So my frog rod is always spooled with 65-pound braid. As I mentioned before, when I am fishing a bladed jig chatterbait on my 7.2 heavy moderate glass rod, I run straight braid to that. I feel like I need that responsiveness and that immediate power and hook set of throwing that glass rod on a chatterbait. I did experiment fishing that rod with fluoro, and I didn't feel like I didn't feel like it was a good match. So when I'm fishing that rod with the chatterbait, I'm always throwing braid on that, and I typically throw about a 30-pound braid on that rod with my bladed jigs. When I'm flipping punching, I kind of do the same thing. I do a 50, 65-pound braid for that, depending on where I'm at. A lot of times, I don't find myself doing a whole lot of punching. Growing up in Nebraska, that wasn't something that was done very often. But this fishing all these big bodies of water down south, I've seen how important that is, and so I've dabbled a little bit in that. So feel free to drop some of your preferences down below for anything that I've already talked about. This is a very, very basic intro, and what I find is more basic and simple I can keep things, the more effective it is, and the more my people learn from it. So I hope that this kind of covered my lineup and how I do things, why I use certain lines for certain things. Again, totally my preferences. This is not the holy grail of what is to be done or what should be done when it comes to bass fishing. It's just what I've learned, what I've experimented with, and what I'm comfortable with based on what rods I'm throwing and my styles of fishing. So if you all have anything to add to that, any recommendations, anything that you do differently and why, drop them in the comments below. I love reading those. That's kind of the coolest thing about our sport, is that we have the unique ability to learn from everybody, no matter if you fish on the bank, fish in a boat, fish in a kayak, fly fish, conventional, all of that. We've got this incredible ability to share our information, and that makes us all better anglers in the end. So if you guys have any questions, I will do my absolute best to get back to you all. But we're gonna head out and do a little birthday dinner for me, as that's coming up here in the next few days, I think. As always, thank you all for watching. I appreciate the support, and hope you all had a great Thanksgiving, and we'll catch you next time.